Adopted into the Grant family at age 4, I always felt like an outsider in their world of wealth and expectations. My adoptive parents, Richard and Ellen, made it clear they'd rescued me from a life of uncertainty. "You're one of us now," Ellen would say, her smile warm but distant. Yet, no matter how many trophies I won or how perfectly I dressed, I was never their true son. That title belonged to Jeremy, their golden boy, their blood. I wasn't bitter, at least I told myself I wasn't. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that my place in their world was conditional. I existed on the edges, filling a role, but never quite belonging. And then there was Victoria. Tori Grant, my father's younger sister, was the family's anomaly. Where the rest of the Grants built empires and hosted galas, Tori painted. She traveled, drank too much wine, and lived on her own terms. To the rest of the family, she was a source of perpetual exasperation. But to me, she was something else entirely. It started innocently. When I was 13, Tori stayed with us for a summer after another one of her relationship disasters. While the rest of the family rolled their eyes at her bohemian antics, I found her fascinating. She introduced me to art, philosophy, and the idea that life didn't have to be as rigid and suffocating as the one my parents had constructed. "You don't have to be like them," she told me once, her voice soft but resolute. "You can be whoever you want." By the time I was in my mid-20s, our bond had grown into something more. Tori was the only one in the family who truly saw me. She didn't compare me to Jeremy or weigh my worth against the family's impossible standards. With her, I could breathe. It was during a summer storm at one of Ellen's infamous family reunions that everything changed. The reunion was typical for the Grants. Forced smiles, polished banter, and an underlying tension no one dared to acknowledge. I'd escaped to the porch after dinner, the storm raging beyond the estate's manicured gardens. Tori found me there, her wine glass in hand. "Mind if I join you?" she asked. "You're the only one I'd let," I replied with a faint smile. We talked for hours, the conversation shifting from casual to deeply personal. She spoke about feeling like an outsider, the weight of the family's expectations pressing down on her, even though she didn't conform to their world. For the first time, I admitted I felt the same. "I see you, Ethan," she said, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Not who they want you to be. Just you." The words were simple, but they hit me with an intensity one couldn't explain. Before I knew what I was doing, I leaned in. She didn't pull away. The kiss was brief, hesitant, but it felt like crossing an invisible line. When we broke apart, we both stared at each other, the weight of what we'd just done settling between us. This can't happen," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. We didn't speak for the rest of the night, but everything between us had changed. In the weeks that followed, we tried to pretend it hadn't happened. I threw myself into work, while Tori returned to her life in New York. But the pull between us didn't fade. Late-night texts turned into clandestine meetings, each one more dangerous than the last. We told ourselves it was just a phase, something fleeting and meaningless. But deep down, I think we both knew better. What started as a storm on the porch had grown into something neither of us could control. The affair had a rhythm to it, a dangerous, thrilling pulse that dictated every stolen glance and hurried whisper. Tori and I became experts at hiding in plain sight. At family dinners, I'd sit at one end of the table, pretending to hang on every word Jeremy said about his latest investment venture. Across from me, Tori would laugh at a joke Dad cracked, her face the perfect mask of familial warmth. But beneath the surface, there was an undercurrent only the two of us could feel. We'd sneak out when everyone else was asleep, meeting in her old car parked down the road, where the leather seats smelled faintly of turpentine and lavender. We never spoke about what we were doing, about what it meant, or where it would lead. We didn't have to. It was at one of Ellen's elaborate autumn galas when the cracks in our facade started to show. The estate was in full swing that evening. Fairy lights strung across the garden, the soft hum of a live jazz band floating through the crisp air. Guests drifted between the ballroom and the patio, their laughter mingling with the clink of champagne glasses. I was helping myself to another drink at the bar when I felt her presence beside me. Tori didn't say anything at first, just reached for her own glass of red wine. Her hair was swept up, exposing the curve of her neck, and the deep green of her dress made her eyes look impossibly vibrant. "You shouldn't look at me like that," she murmured, her voice low enough that no one else could hear. "Like what?" I asked, keeping my tone casual even as my pulse quickened. "Like you're about to ruin everything." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with my drink and a growing sense of unease. It wasn't long before my mother noticed. Ellen had a knack for sniffing out anything that might tarnish the family's carefully curated image. "Have you been spending more time with Tori lately?" she asked one evening, her tone deceptively casual. We were in the sitting room, the fire casting flickering shadows on the walls. Jeremy and Dad were discussing business in the study, their voices a low rumble in the background. "Not really," I lied, forcing myself to meet her gaze. Her eyes narrowed, a subtle but unmistakable sign that she wasn't convinced. "You've always been close, but lately it seems different." I shrugged, feigning indifference. "She's been going through a lot. I'm just trying to be supportive." Ellen didn't respond right away. She simply sipped her tea, her gaze steady and unnerving. "Just be careful, Ethan. Tori has a way of dragging people into her messes. You don't want to end up on the wrong side of one of her adventures." I nodded, but her words lingered long after she left the room. The close call at the gala came 2 weeks later. It had been a particularly tense evening, with Ellen pulling me aside to lecture me about taking my career more seriously and Jeremy making snide remarks about my lack of ambition. By the time the guests started to leave, I was more than ready to escape. Tori found me on the terrace, leaning against the railing and nursing a scotch. She slipped a hand into mine, her touch sending a jolt of electricity through me. "Come with me," she whispered. I hesitated. "Someone will see us." They're too busy congratulating themselves on another perfect evening. Against my better judgment, I followed her. We ended up in one of the guest bedrooms upstairs, the door clicking shut behind us. For a few blissful moments, the rest of the world disappeared. But the sound of approaching footsteps shattered the illusion. "Someone's coming," I hissed, pulling away. Tori's eyes widened, and we scrambled to compose ourselves. She darted into the adjoining bathroom just as the door opened. It was Ellen. Her gaze swept over me, her expression a mix of confusion and suspicion. "What are you doing up here?" "I needed some air," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment longer before she nodded. "Come downstairs. The family's asking for you." As soon as she left, Tori emerged from the bathroom, her face pale. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice trembling. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. We both knew the words were meaningless. The breaking point came a few days later. Tori had left her scarf in my car after one of our late-night meetings. I didn't think much of it until Ellen found it. "Whose is this?" she asked, holding it up with a look of disdain. "Tori's," I said, my stomach dropping. "She must have left it after I gave her a ride." Ellen's gaze sharpened. "A ride?" "At midnight." I stammered, trying to come up with a plausible excuse, but the damage was done. She didn't say anything else, just walked away with the scarf in hand. That evening, Tori called me, her voice tight with panic. "Ellen knows," she said. "She hasn't said anything yet, but she knows." "What do we do?" I asked, my mind racing. "We leave," she said, the words coming out in a rush. "We pack our things and go. Tonight." I wanted to argue, to tell her we could fix this, but deep down, I knew she was right. By midnight, we were on the road, the grand estate fading into the distance behind us. The headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness as we sped away from the grand estate. Neither of us spoke at first. The silence in the car waited with unspoken fears and unanswered questions. Tori gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale against the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "Where are we going?" I asked finally, my voice barely louder than the hum of the engine. "I don't know yet," she admitted, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Somewhere far. Somewhere they won't think to look." It was a non-answer, but I didn't push her. I leaned back in my seat, watching the shadows of trees blur past the window. A part of me still couldn't believe we'd actually done it. Left everything behind in the dead of night. No plan, no destination. By morning, we found ourselves in a small motel off the highway, somewhere in Pennsylvania. The room was a far cry from the opulence of the grand estate. Peeling wallpaper, a flickering fluorescent light, and a mattress that sagged in the middle. But it was quiet, and for now that was enough. Tori sat cross-legged on the bed, her phone in hand. "We need new names," she said, breaking the silence. "New names?" I repeated, sitting down beside her. "If Ellen really knows, she'll call everyone. The police, lawyers, private investigators. We can't risk them tracking us down." The weight of her words hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a temporary escape. It was a complete severing of ties. "Do you really think they'd go that far?" She gave me a pointed look. "You know your mother better than that." She wasn't wrong. Ellen Grant's obsession with maintaining the family's reputation was legendary. If she even suspected the truth about us, she'd stop at nothing to bury the scandal. "Fine," I said. "What do we call ourselves?" Tori tapped her fingers against her phone, thinking. "You can be Evan. Evan Reeves. And I'll be Claire. Claire Bishop." I nodded, repeating the names in my head until they felt like they could be mine. For the first few weeks, we lived in a state of limbo, moving from one town to the next, never staying in one place for more than a few nights. We dyed our hair, swapped out our phones, and paid for everything in cash. It was exhausting, but it worked. No one seemed to recognize us, and for a while it felt like we might actually pull it off. But the strain of our new reality started to take its toll. One night, as we holed up in another rundown motel, Tori paced the room, her movements restless and agitated. "We can't keep doing this," she said, her voice sharp with frustration. "We need to settle somewhere, find jobs, build a new life. And how do we do that without leaving a trail?" I asked, my own patience wearing thin. "We're not exactly trained in disappearing acts." She stopped pacing and turned to face me, her eyes blazing. "Do you think I wanted this? Do you think I wanted to leave everything behind and live like fugitives?" Her words stung, but I bit back my retort. Instead, I stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the empty parking lot below. "I don't know what I think anymore," I admitted. We finally settled in a small town in Ohio, a place so unremarkable it didn't even have a proper name on the highway signs, just a number. The population couldn't have been more than a few thousand, and everyone seemed to know everyone else. It was exactly the kind of place where strangers stood out, but also the kind where no one asked too many questions. Tori found work under her new name at a local coffee shop, while I picked up shifts at a nearby gas station. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid for the tiny, two-bedroom apartment we rented on the edge of town. For a while, it felt like we could breathe again, but peace was fleeting. It started with little things. A curious glance from a coworker, a casual remark from a neighbor. "You're not from around here, are you?" they'd say, their tone friendly, but their eyes probing. Tori brushed it off, insisting we were just being paranoid. "People are nosy," she said. "It doesn't mean they know anything." But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. One night, as I walked home from a late shift, I noticed a car parked across the street from our apartment. Its headlights were off, but the silhouette of someone inside was unmistakable. I ducked into an alley and waited, my heart pounding. After a few minutes, the car drove away. When I told Tori about it, she dismissed my concerns. "You're overthinking it," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. The tension between us grew with each passing day. "You're too careless," I snapped one evening after finding one of her old sketchbooks lying on the kitchen counter. The name Victoria Grant was scrawled in bold letters across the first page. "I forgot, okay?" she shot back, her tone defensive. "Do you have any idea how hard it is to live like this? To erase every trace of who you are?" "I didn't ask for this either," I yelled, the frustration bubbling over. The argument spiraled, each of us hurling accusations until we were both too drained to continue. Tori stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, Tori returned, her face pale and her hands trembling. "Someone's asking questions," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My stomach dropped. "Oh, a man came into the coffee shop today," she said. "He asked about a dark-haired woman traveling with a younger man. Did he say who he was?" She shook her head. No, but he left a card. She pulled a small, unmarked business card from her pocket and handed it to me. There was no name, no logo, just a phone number. They found us, I said, my voice hollow. Torai didn't respond. She didn't need to. We both knew what this meant. The weight of the card lingered in my hand like a burning ember. A single phone number. No name, no other clue. Yet it felt as damning as a signed confession. We need to leave, I said, my voice barely steady. Torai sat at the edge of the bed, her face pale and drawn. And go where, Ethan? Her use of my real name startled me. She rarely slipped like that anymore. But I didn't have the energy to point it out. Instead, I dropped the card on the nightstand, staring at it as if it might explode. We'll figure it out, I said, though the words felt hollow. She sighed, burying her face in her hands. I can't keep running. I'm tired, Ethan. I can't. You think I'm not tired? I snapped, the frustration boiling over. I gave up my entire life for this, for you. And now you want to just sit here and wait for them to find us? Her head shot up, her eyes flashing with anger. Don't you dare put this all on me. You made a choice too, remember? No one forced you into this. For a moment, the room was thick with the silence of things left unsaid. That night, we didn't sleep. Instead, we packed, quietly, methodically, the way we'd done so many times before. Every item went into a bag or the trash. Every trace of Evan Reeves and Claire Bishop erased as if we'd never existed. By dawn, the apartment was empty, the walls stripped bare of the short, fragile life we'd built there. We left town in the early hours, driving west this time. The landscape outside the car window shifted from the flat, gray monotony of Ohio to the rolling hills of Indiana. Neither of us spoke much. What was there to say? By the time we reached Missouri, we were running out of cash and options. We found a tiny rental on the outskirts of a town so small it didn't even have a proper diner, just a gas station with a microwave for heating frozen burritos. The house was little more than a shack, 2 rooms, peeling paint, and a roof that groaned every time the wind picked up. This is it? Torai asked, staring at the dilapidated structure with a mix of disbelief and despair. It's temporary, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. We spent the next few days settling in, if you could call it that. The landlord didn't ask questions, and we didn't offer any answers. Torai took to sketching again, her drawings darker and more chaotic than anything I'd seen her create before. I found work at a scrapyard, the kind of job that didn't require much in the way of identification or conversation. The strain of our new reality began to show in ways we couldn't ignore. Tori's once playful sarcasm turned into biting remarks, her laughter a distant memory. I became more withdrawn, throwing myself into work and spending long hours away from the house. When we were together, the air between us was thick with unspoken resentment. One evening, I came home to find her sitting on the floor, surrounded by torn-up sketches. Her eyes were red, her face streaked with tears. "What's wrong?" I asked, kneeling beside her. She looked at me, her expression a mix of anger and despair. "I don't know who I am anymore," she said, her voice cracking. I didn't know what to say. The truth was I didn't know who I was anymore either. Things came to a head a few weeks later. Torai had started selling some of her artwork under a fake name, hoping to bring in extra cash. At first, it seemed harmless. She'd mail the pieces to a gallery a few towns over, avoiding any direct contact with buyers. But one night, she came home visibly shaken. "What happened?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "One of the buyers asked too many questions," she said, pacing the room. "About where I'm from, where I work. I think he knows." "Knows what?" "That I'm not who I say I am," she snapped, her voice rising. "Why else would he be so interested?" My stomach churned. "Did you give him any information?" "Of course not," she said, but the panic in her voice made it clear she wasn't sure anymore. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to think. "We need to stop this," I said. "No more selling your art. No more taking risks." Her eyes flashed with defiance. "And then what?" "We just scrape by forever, hiding in this godforsaken town until we run out of money and options." "Yes," I said, my voice hard. If it keeps us safe, then yes. She stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she turned and walked out of the room without another word. A few nights later, I came home to find a car idling outside the house. My heart raced as I approached, the headlights casting long shadows across the dirt driveway. When I stepped inside, Tori was sitting at the kitchen table, a man I didn't recognize seated across from her. He was in his late 40s, clean cut, and wore the kind of suit that screamed authority. "Ethan," Tori said, her voice trembling. The man stood, extending a hand. "You must be Ethan," he said. "Or should I say, Evan?" I didn't shake his hand. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice cold. "My name's Andrew Foster," he said. "I work for a private investigation firm." My blood ran cold. "What do you want?" He gestured for me to sit, but I didn't move. "Relax," he said. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to talk." Tori avoided my gaze, her hands clenched in her lap. "You've got some powerful people looking for you," Foster continued. "Your family's worried sick." "Worried," I said, the word dripping with sarcasm. "That's rich. They want you to come home," he said. "Both of you. No charges, no legal action. Just come home." I laughed bitterly. "And let them sweep everything under the rug? Pretend none of this ever happened?" Foster's expression didn't change. "It's a better offer than most people in your position would get." I turned to Tori, my voice tight. "Did you call him?" She flinched but didn't deny it. My chest tightened, a mix of anger and betrayal swirling inside me. "Why?" "Because I can't do this anymore, Ethan," she cried. "I can't keep running, lying, hiding. It's tearing me apart." The room felt like it was spinning. The walls seemed to close in, the weight of her words crushing me. Foster stood, smoothing out his suit. "Think about it," he said, sliding a business card across the table. "But don't take too long. This offer won't last forever." He left, the sound of his car fading into the night. I stared at Tori, my hands trembling. "You betrayed me," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't say a word. The silence between us grew unbearable. After Foster's visit, the business card with his number became a presence in the house, a silent threat neither of us acknowledged. But it was there, sitting on the table, burning in my pocket, haunting our thoughts. Tori withdrew further into herself, spending most of her time locked in the spare bedroom with her sketchbooks. When she emerged, it was only to throw herself into her new art hustle, selling her work under a fake name to galleries far enough away to feel safe. "This is risky," I told her one night after she returned from dropping off a shipment. "We need the money," she replied, brushing past me. "Unless you have a better idea?" The truth was I didn't. Our savings were dwindling, and my under-the-table job at the scrapyard barely covered rent. But her selling art felt like playing with fire. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone would notice, someone would dig too deep. The strain of our situation finally boiled over after another sale. Tori came home visibly shaken, her face pale as she slammed the door behind her. "What happened?" I asked, my stomach nodding. "Someone asked too many questions," she said, pacing the room. "The gallery owner, they wanted to know more about me. Where I'm from, where I live." It felt wrong. My worst fears crystallized in that moment. "We have to stop this," I said. Her eyes flashed with defiance. "And then what?" "We sit here, wasting away until someone finds us anyway." The argument spiraled from there, turning into a shouting match that dredged up every resentment and fear we'd been suppressing for months. "You don't get to tell me what to do," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "I've sacrificed just as much as you have." "This isn't about sacrifice," I shot back. "This is about survival. And you're putting us both at risk." She stormed out before I could say another word, slamming the door behind her. I didn't see her again until the next morning. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at Foster's card with an unreadable expression. "Are you thinking about calling him?" I asked, my voice quiet but tense. She didn't answer right away. Finally, she said, "I don't know." Her honesty felt like a betrayal. The tension came to a head a few nights later, when I came home late from work to find the house in chaos. Drawers had been pulled out, their contents scattered across the floor. Tori sat on the couch, trembling. Someone was here, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. My chest tightened. Who? I don't know, she replied, gesturing to the mess. But they were looking for something. Foster's words echoed in my mind. This offer won't last forever. We have to leave, I said. Tori didn't argue. For the first time, she seemed just as scared as I was. We packed our things and left that night, but the damage was already done. Whoever had found us wasn't going to stop. As we drove west, the silence in the car was thick with fear and unspoken doubts. What happens when we run out of places to go? Tori asked quietly, her voice breaking the silence. I didn't have an answer. The tension between us was unbearable by the time we reached Kansas. I could feel the weight of her doubts, the way she looked at me like I was the one who'd failed her. One night, after we'd settled into another rundown motel, I noticed her sitting on the bed, staring at the business card again. Do you want to call him? I asked. She didn't look at me. Maybe, she said softly. Her answer hit me harder than I expected. What happens to us if you do? I asked. I don't know, she said, tears filling her eyes. The next day, I noticed a car following me as I drove into town for supplies. My chest tightened as I turned down a side street, trying to lose them. But the car stayed close, its headlights burning into my rearview mirror. When I finally pulled into the motel parking lot, the car didn't follow. But the message was clear. We were out of time. They found us, I told Tori that night. She didn't seem surprised. Her calmness unnerved me, but I didn't press her. Instead, I sat in the car late that night, staring at the business card in my hand. I knew what I had to do. The night I made the call, I sat in the car parked at the edge of a desolate field. The stars above seemed distant and cold, like tiny pinpricks of light in an otherwise endless void. My fingers hovered over the keypad, the weight of the decision pressing down on me like a physical force. Tori was back at the motel, lost in one of her increasingly frequent spells of detachment. I didn't tell her I was leaving, not because I wanted to keep her in the dark, but because I couldn't face the confrontation. I dialed the number on Foster's card and waited. Hello. His voice was calm, professional, and eerily familiar. It's me, I said. My voice sounded hollow, even to my own ears. I'm ready to talk. Foster arrived the next morning. He didn't come alone. When I saw his car pull into the parking lot, a second car followed closely behind. A sleek black sedan that screamed official. My chest tightened as two men in suits stepped out, their movements deliberate and controlled. I stayed outside, leaning against the car as Foster approached. He gave me a measured nod, his expression unreadable. You made the right decision, he said. Let's not pretend this is a choice, I replied bitterly. His lips twitched, but he didn't argue. Instead, he gestured to the two men behind him. They're here to make sure this goes smoothly. No surprises. What happens to us? I asked. That depends on how cooperative you are, he said. But your family's influence has its advantages. No legal action, no public fallout. You'll return quietly, and this situation will be handled discreetly. The word handled sent a shiver down my spine. Inside the motel room, Tori was still asleep when I walked in. For a moment, I just stood there, watching her. Her hair was splayed across the pillow, her face soft and unguarded in a way I hadn't seen in weeks. She stirred as I closed the door, her eyes fluttering open. What's going on? She asked, her voice groggy. I hesitated, my heart pounding. They're here, I said finally. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. She sat up abruptly, her eyes wide with panic. You called them? I nodded, unable to meet her gaze. For a moment, she just stared at me, her expression a mix of shock and betrayal. Then she sprang out of bed, grabbing her bag. You had no right, she said, her voice trembling with fury. Tori. No, she snapped, cutting me off. You don't get to decide this for me. She shoved past me, heading for the door, but I grabbed her arm. Stop, I said, my voice breaking. Just stop. We can't keep running. This is the only way. Her eyes filled with tears, but her anger didn't waver. You gave up, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. No, I said, my own voice trembling. I chose to survive. For both of us. The confrontation with Foster and his men was tense but uneventful. Tori refused to look at me as we got into separate cars, our belongings left behind in the motel room like remnants of a life we'd never fully lived. The drive back to Connecticut was long and silent. I stared out the window, watching the landscape shift from the flat plains of the Midwest to the rolling hills of New England. When we finally arrived at the Grant estate, it felt like stepping into another world. The house was as pristine as ever, its grand facade hiding the secrets that had nearly destroyed us. Ellen was waiting in the foyer, her expression unreadable. "Welcome home," she said, her voice as cold as the marble floors beneath our feet. The terms of our return were clear. Tori was to leave the country, settling in Europe under the pretense of pursuing her art. I was to remain in Connecticut, quietly reintegrating into the family and resuming my role as the dutiful son. "We're giving you both a chance to start over," Ellen said during one of our discussions. Her tone was clipped businesslike. "Don't waste it." Her words made my skin crawl, but I didn't argue. The night before Tori left, we met in the garden, away from prying eyes. The air was crisp, the scent of autumn leaves mingling with the faint aroma of Ellen's meticulously tended roses. "So, this is it," Tori said, her voice flat. "I guess so," I replied, my throat tight. She turned to face me, her eyes searching mine. "Was it worth it?" The question caught me off guard. "What do you mean?" "All of it," she said, gesturing vaguely. "The running, the hiding, the lies. Us." I didn't know how to answer. "I thought we could outrun it," she continued, her voice breaking. I don't know what I thought. I reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Goodbye, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "Take care of yourself." I watched as she walked away, her silhouette disappearing into the shadows. In the weeks that followed, life settled into an uneasy rhythm. Tori's departure was explained as a spontaneous decision to focus on her career, and I played my part as the prodigal son returned. But nothing felt the same. The house was colder, emptier, its grandeur a hollow reminder of everything I'd lost. I thought about calling Tori, about finding a way to reconnect, but I knew it would be futile. The chapter we'd shared was over, its pages too stained to ever be rewritten. Sometimes late at night, I'd sit by the lake and think about her. About us. I wondered if she ever thought about me, if she'd found peace, or if the shadows of our choices still haunted her. I'd never know for sure.